Hey, what is up guys, Merganman4 here, and at long last, a new Sontaran story is here. The Sontarans are back in full force, and man does it feel good. Alright, so after the craziness that was last week's episode, War of the Sontarans is definitely a lot more traditional. It very much continues the story set up in the Halloween Apocalypse, of course, but as I had hoped it would be, it's a lot more focused. Instead of, constantly jumping between a whole bunch of different threads, some of the threads from last week are starting to come together now, and there's really only two main stories that we focus on: the Sontaran invasion, and then the more arc-heavy stuff with like Swarm and Azure and that sort of stuff. So I'll try and talk about them, I guess, in two separate sections, focusing on the Sontaran stuff and then the arc stuff afterwards. They do intercut throughout the episode, but it'll be easier just to stick to one particular storyline first, I think. But with the Halloween Apocalypse, we ended with a massive cliffhanger of the universe-destroying Flux approaching the TARDIS with seemingly no way to escape. And last week I expressed concern about how they were going to resolve this, because these kinds of cliffhangers are really difficult to get out of in a satisfying way. And they resolve it by not resolving it at all, really. They just kind of gloss over it, and I'm sure they'll give an explanation later on in the season, but for now, we don't know how they escaped, nor does the Doctor, Yaz, or Dan. They just kind of were in the cliffhanger moment 1 second, and then in the next, they're here in the Crimean War. Although in the Doctor's case, we actually start off with her, I guess, seeing this sort of vision of some sort. It's kind of like this black and white area, and then we see this floating, decrepit house thing. No idea what that is or what it could mean, but I'm sure it's going to be explored deeper later on in the season, but we don't really get any answers there. But I actually kind of like that they don't really explain how they get out of it and just kind of thrust us into the next chapter of the adventure without any sort of explanation. It kind of adds to the unsettling nature of the things that are going on, because it's not the only weird thing that happens in the episode, of course. You've also got things going wrong with the TARDIS and Dan and Yaz randomly disappearing later in the episode, so everything's going crazy, and that kind of adds to that kind of craziness. But anyway, we do get this pre-titles introduction to what this story is basically going to be about, the Sontarans in the Crimean War, and I've always loved Sontarans in historical settings. I feel like they're such a good match for each other, and I'm sure a large part of that is because the very first Sontaran story, The Time Warrior, was set in medieval times. So it just feels so right. And it's a great opening, just seeing an army of Sontarans with one of them on their horse. That's a very striking image to see. We're also introduced to Mary Seacole pretty much right immediately, who is a real-life person that I personally didn't really know much about before going into this episode. But it's something I've always enjoyed in historical stories, learning about the history and the real people who were a part of it. And I think that's been a big strength of this era, and that definitely continues here. Although unlike a lot of other historicals in this era, the episode isn't about Mary Seacole. She's just kind of a part of the events. But even still, I think they do a really good job with her here. She's a very interesting character and immediately very likable. And as I've said before with some of these historicals, I like that this era isn't afraid to dive into historical figures who might be a little bit more obscure and not as much common knowledge as those super famous ones like Shakespeare or Charles Dickens or Vincent van Gogh. Another thing I really appreciated about this is of course another Sontaran invasion of Earth, and there have been quite a few over the years, and of course, there's that question, why do they keep coming back to Earth after they've failed again and again and again? So I like that in this episode they actually address that and make specific reference to Lynx from the first Sontaran story, who basically stuck a flag in the ground and claimed the Earth for the Sontaran Empire. So I like that Chibnall's basically added to the lore of the Sontarans that they keep coming back to Earth because they believe they still have a claim to the planet because of that. I thought that was really cool, and I loved hearing a reference to Lynx. But pretty quickly in the episode, as I mentioned before, Yaz and Dan actually disappear, quite literally. I guess it's kind of due to fallout from the Flux. As I said, some weird stuff is happening, and they both get brought to different places in time and space. Dan ends up going to present-day Liverpool, where there's a concurrent Sontaran invasion, whereas Yaz gets booted off to the Temple of Atropos, which I'll get into later. That's more connected to the Ark stuff. But what this means is that throughout the majority of the episode, the Doctor is actually on her own, and I think this dynamic actually works really well, and I think it also really helps add to some of that desperation that not only is she having to deal with this problem here, but she has to figure out what's happened to her companions. The one thing that I was a little bit disappointed about with that is it means we're 2 episodes in now, and Dan has still hardly spent any time at all with the Doctor, because he joined the Doctor and Yaz fairly late in the last episode, and now in this episode he's separated from her for the majority of it. So next episode looks like it's going to be really trippy, so that's kind of my concern. There's not really much time for them to properly bond because there's constantly stuff happening and getting in the way. So I was a little bit disappointed to see that continue here, but I do think it served this story well. So I can see why they did it. But anyway, we learn that the Sontarans have kind of been ingratiated into Earth's history and have effectively replaced Russia and China, and they are now Sontar, which was... I feel like they could have done more with that than they actually did, but it was still a really cool moment. And I feel like we're going to probably be getting other moments like this throughout the series, as especially later on in the episode we're told like time is beginning to run wild. So things are really starting to shift and go kind of crazy. So I feel like throughout the season this is going to gradually ramp up more and more. But yeah, let's talk about how the Sontarans are actually portrayed in this story, because as I've mentioned before, the last Sontaran story we got was so long ago, and we've had Sontaran appearances since then, but they're like cameos, like the really silly cameo in Time of the Doctor, and most of the appearances that are in any way substantial are from Strax, who is of course just an individual, but he's also very silly. So it's been a really long time since we've seen Sontarans that are actually threatening. Now don't get me wrong, Sontarans are also silly, but that has to be balanced out, which we haven't seen since the Sontaran stratagem and the Poison Sky. So it's really good to see that the grittier, more brutal side of the Sontarans again. I really loved the scene where the Sontaran prisoner goes back to his encampment and he requests mercy, and that mercy in Sontaran terms means an execution. And I like the little twist that Chibnall added on the Sontar Ha, which was Sontar Ho, a kind of shameful version of it. I thought that was really neat. But something that's really exciting is, of course, we get to see the massive scale of the Sontaran army, mainly in the Crimea, but also a little bit in Liverpool, which even in Sontaran Stratagem in Series 4, we saw a lot of Sontarans there, but it wasn't quite to this. We didn't see whole armies all at once. So this is the first time we've actually seen that, and it looks incredible. I love it. I love the scale of it. And when we get to the big battle with the British soldiers, I think it's genuinely one of the best scenes in Sontaran history. Just the way that they are just brutally slaughtering them, and I think it's shot really well. And it does kind of make up for earlier in the episode when a bunch of Sontarans missed Dan, which I thought was kind of funny. But it's great that you get to see them just completely take out this entire army. I'd also like to point out, I'm really happy that they brought back the tongue thing that they do. I love that these Sontarans, they feel right out of the classic series at their best in the classic series. The design of them is like the perfect callback, and I think just the way that they've been characterized works really well. And I do like that these Sontarans do have some individuality to them. They're not completely interchangeable despite being clones. For example, in the last episode, you had it established that Ritzka and Kragar had an old friendship, and also in this episode, I love that Skak says one of the reasons he wanted to invade the Crimean War was because he wanted to ride a horse. I mean, why not? But I think the highlights of the episode for me were the Doctor's confrontations with Commander Skak and General Logan. I thought that these were so well done. And it really makes the whole situation just feel so hopeless as General Logan refuses to let the Doctor talk the Sontarans down from fighting them, and as a result the whole army just gets massacred. And of course near the end of the episode we get to see 13th Doctor possibly the angriest she's ever been as the Sontarans are going to retreat, and General Logan just blows them all up anyway. It's a fantastic moment, and it's moments like these where it baffles me that people can say that Jodie Whittaker doesn't have the acting chops for this role. I think she puts in a stellar performance in this episode. But as I mentioned, the Sontarans are not just invading the Crimea, they're also invading modern-day Liverpool, and this is where Dan's portion of the story happens. And as I said, it's really nice to see an invasion of this scale because in the Sontaran stratagem, it was more limited to unit rather than the general public, whereas here the Sontarans are absolutely everywhere. And I guess the advantage of Dan being separated from the Doctor is it does give him some time to shine on his own as he shows, the initiative. He's not just following along with the Doctor, he shows the initiative to go and do this stuff by himself and risk his life to try and, save the planet. We also get to meet Dan's parents here, who they were fun, I guess, but I don't know, I didn't feel that their inclusion was really necessary. It felt very convenient the way that they met up with Dan again, but yeah, they were fine, I guess, but they had a pretty small role, so yeah, I don't really have much to say about them. I do wonder, though, if they're going to turn up later in the series at all. It would feel kind of weird to me if this was their only appearance. But yeah, I like how Dan infiltrates the ship. There's some really funny humor in here, mostly coming out of how intentionally bad it is. Like you have Dan's misinterpretation of temporal as meaning tempura, which is just so ridiculously stupid that I couldn't help but crack a smile. And also Dan's kind of cocky jokes after he knocks out a Sontaran of "I'm gonna walk all over you" or have pan-fried Sontaran. It really makes Dan such an endearing character. He's very likable. And that's one of the reasons why I'm sort of disappointed that he's been thrust immediately into such a grand scale adventure, because we don't really get any slow moments to learn about him more and spend some more personal time with him. We did get a little bit of that at the beginning of the last episode, but I'd like to have more of that. And this kind of grand scale story doesn't provide as many opportunities to do that. I was also very pleasantly surprised to see Karvanista turn up again, because I knew he would be making appearances later on in the season, but I wasn't expecting him to turn up in this episode, so that was great to see him again. He was a ton of fun in Halloween Apocalypse, and he's just as fun here. And I think very quickly, not just Karvanista, this season has already had some of the best side characters of the era, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of Karvanista, because he's just so much fun. But yeah, basically, Dan and Karvanista take care of the Sontarans in the present, whereas the Doctor and General Logan and Mary Seacole take care of the Sontarans in the Crimea. So that's seemingly the end of them, although I wonder if they're going to make one or two more appearances later on in the season still, tie this story a bit more into it, because otherwise this story very much does feel like it absolutely could be a standalone one. I do wonder if this was originally written for the original Series 13 and it just kind of became folded into the Flux storyline after COVID hit, because it definitely feels like it could be done on its own without much interference. But of course, what can't be done on its own is the arc stuff from this episode. The Temple of Atropos, where Yaz ends up going and meeting up with Vinder. So it's nice to see Vinder's storyline coming into the main storyline and actually being able to meet Yaz. I still really don't have much to say about Vinder, because he still hasn't really done much. So I'm hoping we'll be able to get more from him next episode, because he looks like he'll be playing a pretty big role in it. But yeah, again, all I can really say is I guess he's likable, but that's about it. But I have to say, I really love the vibe of this Temple of Atropos with like the floating triangle thingies, and it just, there's something about it that just feels like Chibnall's creative energies have just been completely let loose, and nothing is off the table. And that's a feeling I haven't had with Doctor Who in a very long time, and it is great to feel that again. The whole vibe of this place, especially when we later learn, it's on the planet Time, and we're learning these Mori things are what control time in this universe. This just feels like Chibnall is just letting all his creative juices flowing and basically being like, anything can happen. And it definitely seems like that's the case looking at the Next Time trailer for the next episode as well. And I love it. I love the vibe of that. I also need to mention, of course, that Williamson shows up here, but it's weird. I can't really say it continues his storyline, but I don't know. He just kind of pops up, talks with Yaz briefly, and then just disappears. And now I'm just even more intrigued as to what's going on. With him popping up here, I can see why they wanted to set him up in the last episode, but we're still none the wiser about how he connects into it all. So, I don't know. What is going on with him? Are we going to find out next week, or is this a mystery that's going to hang over the entire season? I don't know. It's just confusing and weird. But this segment of the story also contains what is shaping up to be my favorite aspect of the season so far, which is Swarm, Azure, and a new introduction of Passenger, who we don't know anything about. I am absolutely loving these guys. As I mentioned last week, their design is incredible, and I'm loving, in particular, Sam Spruell's performance as Swarm. There's just a vibe about it that I really love. And last week we saw a bit of like an introduction to his powers, and he seemed really powerful, and here we get to see that continued with him seemingly, I don't want to say he's necessarily omniscient, but he seems to know everything about Yaz and everything about Vinder, and it's really unsettling and scary. And I love the moment where he goes up to Yaz and kind of like grabs her by the head, and he's just kind of baffled. Why does the Doctor choose any of you? They're so camp, but in the best way possible, because they can also be threatening, and I absolutely love that contrast. But meanwhile, the Doctor has picked up Dan in her absolutely decrepit TARDIS. I have no idea what is happening there, but it's just, it is getting more decayed this episode for sure than it was last time. And I also love the moment earlier in the episode, I don't want to forget, that the Doctor runs over to the TARDIS when she's in the Crimea, and she can't find the doors anywhere. That's such a terrifying concept, being something that there is no sort of precedent for. But yeah, the TARDIS is in such a bad way, and they end up getting brought to the planet of Atropos, where the Doctor finally meets Swarm in person. And it's here that Swarm reveals that they're on the planet of Time, and that the Mori in the temple control the flow of time in this universe, and that they're broken. And he's made some repairs. And he clicks his fingers, and up pop Yaz and Vinder, having been converted into Mori, I guess. And it's such a shocking moment, seeing a companion being put into this sort of situation. Like, this goes beyond the regular, like, companion in peril thing, because as I said, like, all bets are off, anything can happen, and Swarm mentions how the whole flow of time is going to go through them, and yet again another cliffhanger of how are they going to resolve this in a satisfying way. But I do really love this cliffhanger because it feels very old school. The way that Swarm reaches out with his hand about to click his fingers as the cliffhanger sting comes in actually really reminds me of a couple of classic cliffhangers. Although in this case we do actually see Swarm click his fingers, so it's not going to be a case of something stops Swarm from doing it. But yeah, I guess that's everything I wanted to talk about in War of the Sontarans. I'm loving what we've been getting so far. It's a fascinating storyline, and I'm really, really interested to see where it's going to go next. I love the Sontaran stuff. I thought it was great, and I definitely think that there's no doubt in my mind this is the best Sontaran outing since the original in 1973, was it? I think so. So, I'm a very pleased fan right now. I definitely enjoyed this one more than the first episode, and yeah, this one's left me with this quite a big smile on my face, so it's a pretty easy 8 out of 10 for me. But yeah, I guess that's my thoughts on War of the Sontarans. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please leave your thoughts on the episode down in the comments below. And with that, Burgerman 4 over and out. I'll see you next week with Once Upon Time.